Our first guest today, Nate Silver, was recently called the Spreadsheet Psychic by New York Magazine. His website, 538.com, has become a must-read for hundreds of thousands of political junkies. Using the most recent polling and demographic trends, the site simulates the election 10,000 times each day. The site is now projecting Barack Obama will receive 344 electoral votes, 74 more than the 270 needed to win the election. John McCain is projected to win 193 electoral votes.
Nate Silver launched the site 538.com earlier this year in his spare time from being a professional baseball statistician. He's the managing partner of the influential publication Baseball Prospectus. Nate Silver joins us now from Chicago. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Nate.
Yeah, good morning, guys.
It's good to have you with us. Okay, let's start out with the poll that the New York Times is talking about that puts Barack Obama 1 percentage point ahead of John McCain. What do you think of this poll? How should we analyze it?
You know, I think you have to take that one poll from the AP along with the dozen or so other polls that are out that give Obama, larger leads. I think as large as 14 points in certain cases. I mean, there are different philosophies about how to evaluate this election. It is maybe a difficult election when you probably have a lot of new people who are voting. But one thing that some of these pollsters are doing is applying what's called a likely voter model. So that'll take, the voters that say they want to vote and basically kick some of them out of their sample if they haven't voted in the past. They're from demographics that don't traditionally turn out in high numbers. They're kind of basically making an assumption that the election will look like it did in 2004. If it doesn't, and remember the Obama campaign is counting on getting new voters to the polls, young voters, blacks, Latinos, then these kind of more optimistic scenarios, the double-digit leads might come into play instead.
But can you go further on this? How a poll then affects perception? Because the Times writes a piece, they're writing about momentum of John McCain, and you're saying that just to select out this one poll is not representative of the, say, 11 most recent polls.
Yeah, I don't think this poll is particularly good. It had a fairly small sample size. It had a very conservative lowercase c likely voter model. You can kind of cherry pick any number of polls you would want. I mean, right now we have something like, 12 national polls coming out every day. And we have maybe 20 state polls coming out every day. There's a poll came out this morning that had Obama 14 points ahead in Ohio. I don't believe he's 14 points ahead there, but if you wanted to tell a story around that and say, oh, McCain's done for, you could do that just as well. So I think, you have to look at the big picture. If you're going to have that many polls coming out, you're going to have some outliers, almost by definition. You'll have some polls outside the margin of error. If you have 30 polls coming out every day, you're going to have a couple that just randomly end up on one side or the other. So I think the responsible thing to do is to take an average or an aggregate of some kind, to educate yourself about the fact that polling is not an exact science, that these polls can differ a lot from survey to survey. Even the same day, the different survey can produce very different numbers, and then kind of proceed from there.
Now, Nate, how do you work your analysis of these polls? Are you doing basically a meta-analysis, putting them all together, or are you adding particular ingredients of your own to make sense of them?
Well, one of the main things we try and do is to try and discern whether there is any kind of a trend line and who it's moving toward. And so we look not just at the state polls or the national polls, but also at the state polls. For example, if we have a poll, the same polling firm, and Obama improves from say a +5 to a +8, we find that a meaningful data point. Whereas maybe if you have polling from different firms, it doesn't tell you quite as much. But we try and mesh that all together and really kind of see where the election is headed. And right now we see it as being fairly flat. Obama made a lot of gains over the course of the past 6 weeks since the kind of Lehman Brothers collapse. And since then it's kind of plateaued at about a 6 or 7 point lead. But we consider demographic information, we consider kind of as much as we can to kind of deal with this imperfect data, because polls are certainly an imperfect data set.
Now, Nate Silver, these numbers that Juan was just talking about at the beginning, Obama getting 344 electoral votes, 74 more than the 270 needed to win election. McCain projected to win 193 votes, way more than anyone else is predicting. How did you arrive at this number?
Well, it's just looking at the individual states. And one thing about this year's map is the Obama campaign is active in so many places that if they win the national popular vote by 6 or 7 points, that means they'll turn a lot of states blue. They'll probably win, Ohio and Florida. They would certainly win at that level. Virginia and Colorado, which are two states they're very fond of, I think. But even Missouri and Indiana, North Carolina, these are pretty big electoral vote, double-digit electoral vote states. And so, it looks like a landslide when you have a number like 350 electoral votes, but you can get that with even just a 5-point win in the popular vote because of the way, the Obama campaign is engaged in so many kind of battleground states this year.
Now, you drew quite a bit of attention during the primary season, specifically when you were in Indiana and North Carolina. You were making predictions that others had not made and were more accurate. Can you talk about the development of your site and why you decided to move into political analysis from sports?
Well, I think partly it was because I was frustrated with some of the kind of prevailing media narrative. For example, when you do have one poll saying McCain's only 1 point behind Obama, that might generate a lot of attention, but it's not necessarily the best indicator of where the race is at. So that was the kind of thing that bothered me. Sometimes people oversimplify demographic questions. For example, during the primaries, there was a lot of attention about, well, Obama doesn't perform well with Latino voters. And really that wasn't about, skin color. It was about economic class, and Hillary Clinton did fantastically well with working class voters, both Latino and white. But there was nothing about, oh, brown people won't vote for black people. And then once we had the general election, you saw Obama's doing very well with Latino voters. So it was things like that where I think there was a lot of sloppy analysis in the mainstream media, where I wanted to kind of have my say, and also to kind of be served to put some public pressure on these pollsters who might not tell you why they're doing what they're doing, who might not really have thought their methodology through, and to kind of expose pollsters that do a bad job and aren't very accountable for when they just kind of throw a bunch of numbers together. So that was really kind of the goal, I think.
We're talking to Nate Silver. Now, why should people believe you, especially people who don't follow politics, so they might be getting into it the way the media covers it as a game. But so you develop PECOTA, Player Empirical Comparison and Optimization Test algorithm. Explain what this is. This is for baseball. You predicted the Rays would get into the World Series?
We predicted the Rays would win 89 or 90 games this year and be a playoff contender. We actually had them, behind them and the Red Sox and the Yankees all kind of in a tie in the American League East. But PECOTA is a system I developed 5 or 6 years ago. It uses comparable players. If you have a guy like Derek Jeter, you look at, maybe Phil Rizzuto, players in the past who were similar to Jeter, and you look at how their different kind of careers went down different kind of branches of the probability tree, so to speak. But, I did move into, politics this year, and, as we mentioned before, I got some things right, like Indiana and North Carolina, where the polling wasn't very accurate, really. If you looked at the polling in the primaries, Barack Obama routinely overperformed his polls in southern states by 7 or 8 or 9 points. So we looked at the demographics as well. We had so much information about the primaries when we'd had contests in 25 or 30 states that we almost didn't have to look at the polling there. But, it's just trying to be as rigorous as possible. I do like sweating the small stuff and the details, and getting into this level, this kind of granularity. It's kind of my methodology and my brand, I suppose. But we want to be as thorough as possible, but also have some fun with it and realize that it is a horse race. The polls aren't the most serious thing in the world. You don't have to, you don't have to have a bad day if your candidate loses a couple of points in the Gallup tracker or the Zogby tracker. So try and
Can you talk about Gallup and Zogby? What do you think of these other pollsters? And then I know you have this running battle with ARG.
Yeah, I mean, we have ratings of, maybe the 23 most prolific polling firms, and, obviously the firms that we rank toward the top I've heard from, and they're very friendly, and some of the ones toward the bottom are not quite as friendly. There are different things that kind of go into being a successful pollster. I think part of it is obviously your track record.